Don't you know the Dewey Decimal
Decimal
System?
System. And he lifts the guy up by his collar.
Today on the Greens and Blues podcast, Eric and I have decided to do something a little different than what we've been up to. We're going to give you some of our hot takes on a variety of issues. Without further ado, Eric, I'm ready. I'm in my flame-proof suit. Give give me a hot take, buddy. Let's feel this.
All right. I'll start out a little bit on the calmer side. I want to go through one of my favorite mountains in Colorado. So several episodes ago, we went through our favorite 14er, Uncompahgre. I have another mountain that is probably in my top three in Colorado, but it's not a 14er. It's not a 13er. And for that reason, I think it's relatively unknown to much of the Colorado community. Thank you to James Zdzinski, and I apologize, I probably got your name wrong in several places there, but thank you for your book, Best Summit Hikes of Colorado. My wife got me this book several years ago when I was starting to really get into my mountain journey. And so he is unabashedly opinionated about what he thinks are 50 of the best hikes in Colorado involving the mountains. And one of them was very eye-opening because it's a 12er. It's a relatively unknown 12er, but it has some very distinct and really cool features about it that make it worth talking about. So the name of this mountain is Bison Peak. So Bison Peak is basically the king of the Terrials and of Lost Creek Wilderness. So it sits at about 12,430 according to Summit Post, and they claim the round trip is about 12 miles, a little bit on the long side, with about 3,800 feet of elevation gain. So a little bit much in the elevation gain
Mm-hmm.
portion of it too. But basically, if you're coming from Denver, you go down 285, you come around Kenosha Pass, you see that beautiful view of the valley down there,
Yeah.
and you drive into the town of Jefferson. You turn at Park County 77, and you drive down somewhere 15 to 17 miles on what Summit Post claims is a well-paved road. I thought I recall some of it being kind of gravelly and maybe even a little washboarded, but they say the road is good. In any case, a passenger car can easily get down there and get to the trailhead, which is on the left. And so I remember hiking it several years ago with my wife Rachel's brother, Justin. And so he and I started out, we got out early and make our way up. It's class one the entire way. It's a great trail, but it's steep, not in an exposure way, but just in an effort way. You got to grind it out.
Grunt
And
factor is higher.
the grunt factor is definitely higher, and it kind of kicked my butt. I'll be honest. For a 12er, I was expecting a little easier, but it didn't go easy on me. So eventually you get to about tree line, and because it sits at about 12.4, the summit really isn't very far beyond tree line. And what's really cool about Bison Peak is I'd say there's a couple things. One is that once you get to the summit, your views all around Lost Creek Wilderness, even up to the Mosquito Range, it's just a really pretty view. And you've got this really cool perch within Lost Creek because, again, this is the highest point of the Terrial Wilderness. And so you're kind of in the middle of it all. And it looks really cool kind of all around. But really the selling factor for Bison Peak is that what's on top of the summit, it's pretty flat summit too, actually, are these really cool rock formations that they're like, I don't even know how to explain it. It's kind of like a miniature Garden of the Gods with what I would call overgrown cairns. Like if you just took a bunch of cairns from the trail and adhered all the rocks together, built up, and then enlarged them like 1,000 times, you've got tons of these rock formations up there that are just like that. And
Nice.
it looks amazing. And if you want to, I mean, you can actually kind of scramble on these for a while if you're up for it. I think Justin and I, when we went, we found a summit marker somewhere up within one of these rock formations. I mean, that's where the GS put it. And so it's just a really cool environment. It's almost looked like this alien world that you weren't expecting at the top of a 12er, but it looks really cool. The views from the mountain are spectacular, and because it's a 12er, no one else was there. I think we saw one person with their dog the whole time that we were
Wow.
there. And, we were there for, several hours going up, staying up there and then coming down. So I think Bison Peak is a fascinating mountain. I loved it up there. I love the whole journey, going up, spending time up there, coming back down. It was a lot of fun. And I do think it's a real hidden gem of Colorado, and I think it's worth checking out.
Much love to the non-13er and 14er peaks from Eric. I love that. Being a guy from New Mexico, every summer I would go hike South Sandia Peak, which is like 9,980 feet.
Mm,
Great peak though. Ton of fun. It was always I always had the place to myself.
mm,
There's awesome peaks in New Mexico. There's Capilla Peak, there's North Sandia, there's Pecos Baldy, there's Mount Taylor. There's so many cool peaks. Well, down in the Gila, there's Whitewater Peak and Whitewater Baldy and some others. Those are all 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 foot peaks, but they're just sometimes even harder than some of the 14ers we talk
mm-hmm.
about here and have interesting features. And because they're not 14ers, are a lot less traveled.
Yep.
And you have a little bit more isolation and a little bit more of that wilderness feel to it. So I thought you were going to come in angry today, Eric. I know you're a pretty stoic dude, but I thought your hot take was going to come in a little hotter than that.
Well, I've got somewhat of a maybe a warm take or a
Mm,
slightly warmer than warm take coming up, but I wanted to kick it off a little bit on the lighter side maybe and kind of share something that I thought was cool as opposed to hot.
I love that. That's everybody should just cherish being outside
Hmm.
and in all its different forms. I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I do think we've become very list
Hmm.
centric
Oh yeah.
and 12ers. Now, there are some people that are trying to do all the high points in Colorado 12ers, 13ers, 14ers, but there's just value to just going to cool places with cool views and cool
Hmm.
rocks. And Lost Creek Wilderness is awesome.
It is. It's a lot of fun
So
there.
I'm digging that, Eric.
Awesome. Well, Zach, what do you got for us?
Okay, well, I'm yours is a lot less. I might actually anger people with mine. I When I think of hot take, I think of Peter Griffin.
Yeah.
What grinds my gears?
Oh, there you go.
So I routinely go down to the San Juans, where my family has a cabin, and I hike a lot down there, both going up peaks and just hiking. And one of the primary modes of access is the Alpine Loop. So that's County Road 20 and County Road 30. You start in Lake City, you go all the way up one of the legs to Animas Fork, and then you go over like Cinnamon Pass, and then you drop back down. One thing that I have noticed in the last 5 years in particular is that look, there's always been an active Jeep crowd that likes to do the Alpine Loop. And there's always been a lot of people that four wheel it. That's fine. That's all good. I am certainly not going to besmirch that. That's how I get trail access, right? I have no problem with that. What I have noticed though are, let's be honest, they're mainly dudes in side by sides that are jacked up that they're essentially racing the Alpine Loop.
Oh man.
They are in these big jacked up side by sides, and a lot of them have on headphones because the motor is so loud, and they're blasting music, and they have flashing lights all over these things, and they look like dune buggies just rocking up and down this pass. and it bothers me. I think that jeeping and doing an ATV certainly makes noise, but this is a different level of noise. It's a different level of erosion. It's a different kind of traveling through the space where people that are on jeeps and whatnot, they are stopping a lot. They're getting out, they're hiking around, they're getting out a picnic. These guys are just blasting up and down the Alpine Loop, going as fast as they can. And it bugs me. I don't have any like great philosophical argument why. I just don't think it's what America's wilderness was intended for.
Sounds dangerous too.
It actually is. A lot of these, if anyone that's listening to this has driven the Alpine Loop, there's a lot of blind corners, particularly on the upper end of the loop. And yeah, the possibility of coming around that corner and some of these guys screaming up the corner is kind of high. So yeah, it's dangerous. It's made the road way more washed out and eroded than it has been since I've been using it for the last 25, 30 years. That's also happened with more traffic, but in particular, the faster you drive and the more traction you have, the more you're going to chew up the road, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
so the road's more chewed up, it's more dangerous, and you can just hear the buzzing of these motors going up and down these passes as you're doing your hike. It's just
Hmm.
going up and
Yep.
down. So
Yep.
I'm not a fan. I don't think I ever will be a fan of it. And if people don't like me for that, well, then that's okay. I can accept that.
No, do you think these are residents or folks that are just visiting the area and just don't care about how they leave the environment?
The residents there, like of Lake City does have a couple places where you can rent side by sides, but for the most part, these are people that come in, they trailer in these big side by sides. And there was a big controversy a few years ago. Silverton actually limited. So Silverton used to allow people to drive their side by sides into the city of Silverton or the
Oh.
town or the village of Silverton. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
what it technically is. And they decided to limit that because of the noise and the dust. And not all of Silverton's roads are fully paved and the
Mm.
erosion of the roads. And there's a lot of angst about it. So now the only town in Colorado that allows people to drive through it in a side by side is Lake City. And yeah, I don't think it's residents of at least of those towns. I think it's people from, frankly, from my part of the world. I live in central Oklahoma. I'm sure there's a lot of my fellow Oklahoma brethren and sisterin that are doing this. I don't want to feed into anti-Texas animosities, although that may be a hot take later on. That I'm sure there's people from Texas. I know I see a lot of Kansas plates, but it's not so much about that sentiment. Colorado depends on people coming in from out of state and using their areas recreationally. I'm not
Oh yeah.
That's not my bother. My bother is the way that it's being done, and it seems to kind of miss the point of, like, at that point, why not just go out to like Barren Salt Flats and just zip around
Race
out
around.
there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, or go to a dune buggy course. And surprisingly, if you're close to the roads now in the Alpine Loop, you're never going to see wildlife because of all that noise.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Hmm. I think you're spot on. That in my mind, there's should be no place for that. I mean, you're not doing any good whatsoever by doing that, by acting that way, by treating the roads, treating the environment that way. I don't see any positives at all that come from that.
Well, and that overuse is going to lead to a real problem. I'm betting we're just a few years off from a permit system
Mm.
in the Alpine Loop. And for those of us that like to call it by the weather, like, I'm going to wait until I get a clear day with, only 40% chance of rain to go do Wetterhorn or Uncompahgre or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a problem because a permit system kind of locks you into a day and a time. So I wish the four-wheeling community would police it a little bit more and limit this kind of activity so that we're not all kind of collectively punished. But
Yeah.
it may have to happen like it did at Ice Lake in the San Juans. became so Instagram worthy that everybody was driving up there and destroying the trails.
Mm,
And there is such a thing as loving a place to death. So I worry about that. I worry about what it might mean for hikers like me that just want to go up there and climb Half Peak or, you know, do Sunshine Red Cloud or whatever on any given day. And yeah, it may mean that I have to be a lot more thoughtful about it or just go somewhere else. Looks like I may cross off the Lagarita list a lot quicker if it does that. So
hmm.
yeah.
Not necessarily at the pace you were intending, if that's what ends up having to happen, which stinks. Your story reminds me of maybe a related, somewhat hot take as well. And I won't get into the full story of when I summited Antero, but Antero is, I think it's from Baldwin Gulch, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's the standard route.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically a long road.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I won't get into my story of summiting Antero, but I have a buddy that I hiked a few 14ers with several years ago named Anthony. And he was telling me stories of when he was trying to hike Antero along the road. And he was basically getting run over by Jeeps that were driving up, drinking their beers, hooting and hollering, and just having a grand old time driving up to get a 14er, even though their their legs were probably working for an hour to get from that very upper parking lot to the summit and back. So I'm not going to judge anyone for doing that, but I'm not thrilled at a carelessness and a recklessness of not just endangering people that are legitimately trying to hike the trail, but also just you're not doing the mountain any favors. You're not doing the environment any favors. And anyone that believes at all in leave no trace, I don't want to know what kind of trace you're leaving if you're acting like that and being a fool up there. So, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. There's got to be a better way to have a 14er culture and a mountain culture rather than just kind of zipping around and not really caring about the effect that you're going to have on our wilderness.
Originally, wilderness was intended to be a slow experience.
Yeah,
You know, yeah, and look, I'm guilty of this. A lot of the peaks that I do, I drive in the morning, I hit it hard, and I'm home by the afternoon, right? Originally, these wilderness areas were from the 1870s, 80s, and of course, wilderness as a designation came from the Wilderness Act of 1963, I believe. Those were all intended to be much slower experiences, and we've now sped that up because we can, because we've got better technology and better access. But I don't know if that's in keeping with the original intent of what some of these spaces are for. Although, you know, who knows what the original intent of Antero was for? That's a mining road,
it's a
right?
mine. Yeah,
That
yeah,
was
exactly.
extractive.
They were getting
And
aquamarine out of there. Yep.
yeah, and there's still active prospects on there.
Hmm.
So the
You're right.
original intent there wasn't wilderness. The original
No.
intent there was pulling stuff out of the ground. But yeah, I'm with you. There needs to be a better ethic about those things so that we can all share this in our own ways. I'm of the opinion that if you can hike it, you should, and that four-wheeling and stuff should be reserved for getting there or getting to the trailhead or for those who have inabilities and they want to get further up, but they can't.
Hmm.
So yeah. You said you had multiple hot takes today, Eric. You gave me a lukewarm one, then I came in and offended half the people that listen to this. So what are you going to do to salve that burn?
Oh, I my salve is probably going to be made out of ghost peppers or something else that it's not going to be good. So I have a little bit of an issue with at least part of the Yosemite Decimal System. So I find that it's relatively subjective, and it probably always will be, no matter what we
Mm-hmm.
do. I mean, at least it's there. It's better than just saying, "Oh, this mountain was really hard." Well, what does that mean?
Briefly, what is the Yosemite Decimal System?
Ah, the Yosemite Decimal System is the class rating that is used to determine how difficult a route is or how difficult a hike is. I think it was established in the 1950s. I want to say the Sierra Club may have been the body that established it, but other countries have similar rating systems for their hikes. Different European countries have different ways of evaluating how difficult a route is, and they're all a little bit different, but I think they kind of get at the same thing. It's a way to kind of compare different routes and how difficult they are and kind of get a sense of what your capabilities are. So for us, the Yosemite Decimal System, it goes from class 1 to class 5, and there's some generally accepted criteria for each one. Class 1 is basically it's good trail most of the way. Class 2 is maybe some good trail or some trail segments, but other parts where you kind of have to make your own way and maybe occasionally put your hand down to get leverage. And then 2 plus and getting into 3 is there's some scrambling involved where you got to do some hand over hand climbing and kind of pull yourself up here and there. And then class 4 is, you really start adding a lot of exposure in there. And then class 5, you almost virtually have to use a rope. One thing that I think that Jerry Roach and Bill Middlebrook have done to try to alleviate the subjectivity of the Yosemite Decimal System is they have different ways to kind of add to it, if you will. So Jerry Roach in the Colorado 14ers book has what he calls Roach points. I think we've referred to this a little bit in previous
Roach points
episodes.
and effortlty.
That's right. So he measures each route that he's hiked on a 14er by Roach points, and the higher the number of Roach points, the more difficult or the more effortlty that's required. The more effort and more difficulty a route will present to a hiker. And so you can use his Roach points to kind of compare two routes and say, oh, well, I've done a route that is 150 Roach points, but there's one that I'm interested in that's 170. Maybe I could give it a go. It's kind of in the ballpark.
Yeah.
It has its limitations still, though, because it's a number. It doesn't really clarify why it is there's effort and why it is that there's difficulty. Now, he does summarize each route in his book, and he does include with each route the round trip and the elevation gain and loss. So that's definitely helpful. Bill Middlebrook does the similar thing. He lists the class, he lists round trip and elevation gain, and he adds on as well other categories that would affect the rating of a route in terms of exposure, route finding, commitment, things like that. And he'll assign descriptors like low, medium, high,
Considerable.
considerable, extreme. Yeah. So he's got ways to kind of reduce some of the subjectivity as well. But at the end of the day, it's still, there's a lot of information that can be found and almost needs to be found in order to really have a good gauge of whether a route is going to be doable for any individual or not. One thing that I really like about the Yosemite Decimal System is that for class 5 climbs, there literally is a decimal. They can go from 5.0 all the way up to 5.15. And so that number following the decimal just kind of is a subsection of class 5. And even if you get to the higher numbers, I want to say 5.10 and higher-ish, you can add letters as well to
Yeah,
kind of denote
510A,
difficulty.
510B,
Yep.
511A. Yeah, I mean, for the longest time, 510 was it,
I think that was
right?
the highest, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's the
Yep.
highest it was supposed to go, and then people started doing routes that were higher. So then
Mm-hmm.
they would do 510C,
Mm-hmm.
510D, and then people started doing 511s and
Mm-hmm.
512s. And yeah, as human ability has grown, so too has the YDS, right?
Yep. Yep. So one thing that I think would be helpful, and maybe it would make the process a little more objective, although it's always going to be some level of, well, I'm of a certain ability and here's the rating I would give a mountain and that's just the way it is. But I think there might be some benefit to having similar subsections with the other class ratings. So if I look at class 2, we talked in our easiest 14ers episode, one of the easiest mountains, I think, in the state, or at least easier 14ers, is Mount Bierstadt. It's just straightforward. There's a good trail almost the entire way. It's not a super long trail, and you gain a fair amount of elevation, but not a ton. But it's still rated class 2. I think that's because there's probably a short, sustained section at the end you're kind of just rock hopping, but it's still rated class 2. I would consider that if we had subsections like a 2.2 or 2.1 or something like that, And then we could go all the way up to like a 2.10, which might be something more like a Holy Cross or something like that, which has much longer round trip. You've got much more elevation gain and loss, and then gain again. And you do have some class two rock hopping at the end as well. So it legitimately is class two, but it's considerably harder class two than Mount Bierstadt is.
It's weird to lump Mount Bierstadt in with like Grizzly Peak
Yeah.
or Uncompahgre is a class two, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
gully there that's kind of sketchy.
Mm-hmm.
Or like I said, Grizzly Peak, which is I just did this past summer, has if it's got snow on it, it's a lot harder.
Mm.
And as a teacher, my student that gets a 99 gets the same grade as the student that gets an 89.5,
Mm.
right?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
those are both A's, but they're very different A's.
Exactly.
And particularly with class two, those are both class twos, but they're very different class twos, right?
They are. And especially in Colorado where there are, I don't know how many class two and two plus mountains are. There's like maybe 30 of them, at least 14ers. There's a wide swath of class two. And if you could establish something like a 2.1 to 2.10 being class two, and even go like 2.11 to 2.15 as two plus, because there's differences between Castle Peak and let's say Blanca. I mean, they're both two plus. I personally think Blanca is a little tougher than Castle was, but that's just me. I think that having a little bit of separation within, say, class two, and even all the classes, I think, could benefit from this, but particularly in Colorado for
Yeah.
class two 14ers, if there's a little more separation, I think that might be helpful for those that want to consider more class twos, but just don't know what's involved with them. And one example I think of that it makes me laugh every time is Missouri Mountain. So
Hmm.
Missouri is a pretty straightforward class one hike for a good chunk of it through Elkhead Pass in that area. You're hiking up, you eventually just gain the ridge and you hike this
Hmm.
class two ridge all the way to the summit, except for this little teeny weeny little section that's two plus that thankfully Bill Middlebrook talks about. It's a class two 14er. I mean, this little two plus section it's there. I've read in forums how people didn't know that it existed and they got turned back because they didn't realize this little two plus step down was there and it's a bit exposed and you
Hmm.
got to be ready for it. But that mountain is a class two mountain for sure. I mean, like other than that section, it's a pretty straightforward hike. So I think that calling it class two is certainly fair. It's not harder than Holy Cross overall or massive, but that little section can scare people off. And so I think to add a couple of sub points in there for that section, I think could be helpful. And people might say, oh, why is it whatever, 2.7? And well, they can read up on why it's a little more difficult than, say, Chavano or whatever else you want to compare it to. So I think there'd be some benefit to modifying the YDS, at least in Colorado and at least around 14ers, but that's just me.
Oh, I agree. I I have similar feelings about class three. So here are two class three peaks. One of them is Wetterhorn,
Mm,
which has, for the most part, is class two plus when you kind of get down to business. And then it's got a little section at the end that's you got to use your hands a little bit. Another class three peak, which isn't a 14ers to Harris Peak in the
mm.
Sangres, and it's much harder, or the crux of it is much harder. The crux of it is a section where the use of your hands is not optional, it is obligatory,
Mm,
and a fall would not be fatal, which is probably why it's still class three, but a fall there is more likely than it is on Wetterhorn. I feel like Wetterhorn on your system would be like a 3.2 and
mm-hmm,
to Harris would be a 3.7.
mm,
Um, so yeah, a lot of these, I think for people that are kind of investigating them or doing beta, it would help to kind of know where it is on that gradient, right? Because
mm-hmm.
all these things are on a gradient. You're never going to eliminate subjectivity from these things.
Right.
A lot of these are based on your experience, your ability. I mean, the guy that we just interviewed in our last two episodes, Justin Simoni, what's class three for him is It's probably 4 for me,
Oh
right?
yeah.
But I think there are some objective notions of what it takes or what it takes for most folk.
Mhm.
And everybody knows when one is harder than the other. Everybody knows that Castle and Conundrum are harder than Tabawatch.
Mm. Yep.
And that I think there needs to be some way to differentiate those for people in guidebooks. And I do like the way Middlebrook and Roach have tried to do that. And I think theirs is probably getting closer to it. But why not just expand on the Yosemite Decimal System? I feel like we're talking about the Dewey Decimal System, but why
We
not
can talk
just
about that too if you want. Yeah.
did you ever see this Weird Al Yankovic movie in the 1980s UHF?
That is my favorite movie of all time. And I love Conan the Librarian. That's
Yes.
great. I want to go to Mod Pizza and just that's my name for all four pizzas in our family. I got four pizzas for Conan the Librarian. I want to do that someday.
Don't you know the Dewey Decimal
Small
System?
system. And he lifts the guy up by his collar.
Yeah, I mean it's a system we all know and understand. We know what 1 through 5 is. We like the roundness of it, and I think adding degrees to that is not hard. So maybe Eric, we should start doing that. I'm going to take your
Ah,
cue, dude. From
there we
now
go.
on, next time we talk about a mountain, we're going to do it on the MYDS, the modified Yosemite Decimal System, or the, since Eric lives in Central Colorado, the CCDS,
Oh,
the
there you
Central
go.
Colorado Decimal System.
I like it.
That's a good insight, Eric. And I think again, you're remaining blissfully non-offensive, but I think that's a great take. You're coming
Awesome.
in with good ideas here. This is productive. Mine is utterly unproductive, right? Like I was just like whining. Uh,
No, you're telling people that they should stop doing the dumb stuff that they're doing because it's not doing any good. There's
yes,
value in that.
straighten up.
That's right. All of
Take off
us.
your headphones while you're driving a mountain pass. Turn down the REO Speedwagon or what Dawkin or whatever it is that dudes
Oh,
listen to while they're ripping 40 on the Alpine Loop. I
oh
don't know
my
what that would
gosh.
be. It's probably not Dawkin. It's probably
Well,
like speed metal or something like that. But
yeah, it's anthrax or something.
yeah, yeah. Well, Eric, any more hot takes from you?
I've got one maybe slightly hot take. It's not even mine. It's a buddy of mine's. So, in a couple of recent episodes, we went through our top 10 pieces of gear to have with you on the mountain, as well as 10 of the essentials that we should all know about hiking the mountain. So, my buddy Travis, who got me hooked on 14ers to start with and who I've hiked several with, he sent me a text after listening to both those episodes and said, "Hey Eric, here are my top 10 list." And he listed, there were some articles of clothing in there and obviously like his camelback and a jar of peanut butter he had for food. But one thing that surprised me and I thought was really good, really insightful that he put in his top 10 was his hiking partner. And I know, I've summited a few mountains solo. I know you do that a good amount. I don't think he was bagging on that at all. I think his point was if you have a hiking partner, don't leave them behind. And he told me this story, and he's told me this story before. Long time ago, he was hiking a 14er. I won't say which one, but he was hiking with a buddy of his, and they both got to the summit, and it started kind of lightning around them. So his buddy took off and just went down the mountain without
Bolted.
Travis, and he bolted. And Travis ended up hurting his knee on the way down. And
Oh
so
wow.
he really could have used his hiking partner to help him back down. So I'm I'm kind of summarizing everything. There's a lot more detail to it, but Travis basically got to the bottom. He was okay other than a hurt knee, and his buddy was just hanging out down there. Didn't wait for him, didn't
What took you so long?
yeah, exactly. That was his that was his attitude. And it made me think that kind of stinks. No one's ever done that to me, and I don't think I've ever done that to anybody else, but I think if you've got a hiking partner, stay with them or stay within earshot, stay relatively close to them because there's a reason you have a hiking partner. It's in case one of you gets in trouble. If you want to hike solo, again, I've done some solo hikes. You've done a good handful of solo hikes. If you know your limits, you know your abilities, and you're able to do solo hikes, that's a great thing. But if you know you're on a trail or on a mountain where you could probably use a hand, or you would at least feel safer having a hiking partner with you, stick with that person. There's a reason they're there, and there's a reason you're there.
Absolutely.
When Travis
Yeah.
told me that story again, I thought, "Oh my gosh, that's a crazy one." So maybe that's the hottest take I've got right now is if you've got a hiking partner, don't bolt on them, even if there's lightning
No
around.
man shall
Stick
be
with
left
them.
behind.
That's right.
Yeah, perhaps this goes under hiking proverbs that we need to probably collect. But if you're hiking with someone, I think it should be generally accepted that with the exception of going to the bathroom or, hey, I'm gonna be within eyesight of you and I'm gonna go run up and tag this peak or whatever. You and I have done that where you can
Oh,
like literally see me the whole way.
absolutely.
Short of that, you should not leave someone behind. And I think that more often than not works out fine. But boy, the times where it doesn't, there's a lot of regret
Yep.
in there. I have one that my dad has always told me, and then I found myself passing on to my daughter the other day when we were out hiking around was when you're at the top, you're only halfway there,
Oh, for sure.
right?
That's a
Like you're
great
not
one.
home yet.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the statistic? 80% of all hiking accidents happen on the descent.
Mm.
So as it did apparently with Travis.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a bunch of those little maxims for hiking that I think are really important. But if you're gonna hike with someone, I feel like you've made a commitment for the day to stay together.
Yep.
And even if you're good at solo, like you said, I've done more than 100 peaks by myself. Very comfortable doing that. But if I hike with someone, I'm hiking with someone.
Yep.
And that's my commitment for the day. And you accept what goes with that, which is we may not do everything that I want to do because it's not an I anymore, it's a we.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I support the buddy system. What is it on Napoleon Dynamite? No more flying solo in the
Oh yeah.
Rex
Rex
Kwando.
Kwando. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
We support the buddy system. So I think that some people probably performatively find that problematic. Like when they get out there, like, oh no, I could do this on my own. You just
Mm.
wait here. But
Yep.
I've seen where that goes awry. Like, where did John go? Well, I don't know. I didn't see him at the top. There are a few cases where that's gone horribly awry. So yeah,
Yep.
in general, stay together. And if it's lightning, run down together, hold
You want
hands.
exactly right.
It can be like the notebook. Yeah, I
I love that
remember
there's a
Eric.
notebook reference in there.
Speaking
That's
of Missouri Mountain, Eric and I, well, it was actually coming down off of Belford,
Belford and
right?
Oxford, I think. Yeah.
Belford and Oxford, we
Get
were getting
dumped on.
dumped, hailed on,
Yeah.
comically so. And I remember we were both kind of running down to Elkhead
That's
Pass,
right.
and I was grateful that we were keeping up with each other there because I'm not sure how committed we were to the buddy system at that point. It's like we need to get into the trees here.
It worked out.
So the LiDAR results came out where they adjusted the elevations of a bunch of Colorado peaks.
Yeah, yeah.
It was interesting. There's a thread on 14ers.com and they show kind of the peaks that kind of got bumped up. So a couple made it from 12ers to 13ers.
Oh.
One of them was Peak 8 near Breckenridge.
Yo, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
my peak count went up by one.
Oh, sweet.
But then they dropped two of my peaks that I had climbed that were ranked into unranked. But I don't care about that. It's peak's a
Yeah,
peak.
that's
I don't
yeah,
care if
it's
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 ranked or
still
unranked, but
still above 13,000 feet. So yeah,
still
it's
above. And honestly, some of the ones that are ranked, like there's Twin Peaks A and B, which are near Rinker Peak on the Swatch.
okay.
Somehow those are ranked. Those are incredibly easy to hike. Whereas like there's peaks that I've hiked that are unranked that are really quite difficult. So yeah, I know ranked and unranked is not a signifier for difficulty, but it was fun. I readjusted my peak list last night. I was like, oh, look, I got one more.
That's kind of
So
cool.
yeah.
So I'm curious because I don't know this. I know the criteria for an official versus unofficial 14er,
Mhm.
but is it the same for a 13er? Is it still vertical prominence and 300 feet, or is it a different number,
It
different
is
criteria?
that, but then the ranked and unranked is more a matter of whether or not it's been received by the community as a peak.
Oh, so it's
It's,
more subjective.
I think so. There's a Middlebrook has commented on it somewhere on a thread, and I saw him talking about how he classifies it.
Okay.
Because it's sometimes there's even points on topographic maps that are 13,000 foot points. So, like, for example, this past summer, I hiked Grizzly Peak. And as I descended the protruding East Ridge on Grizzly, and I stayed to the ridge. And there's a pretty prominent point along that ridge. And picking your way along that ridge is not all that easy. It's class 2+/3 in places.
Okay.
And there's a pretty prominent bump far out along that ridge that's at 13,000 feet. And if you look on the topo for that, both the National Geographic Trails Illustrated and the old USGS quadrangle, the 7.5 minute quad, have that point marked as a 13,000 foot point.
Okay.
But if you go to 14ers.com, that's not even ranked or unranked. So I guess it doesn't have enough prominence.
For prominence,
It
yeah.
doesn't have enough prominence. So I do think they still abide by that. But then there's other peaks that are ranked and unranked that are 13ers that I'm not sure sometimes what constitutes an unranked peak and a ranked one. For
Yeah.
me, I'm not getting hung up on that stuff. To me, if it's 13,000 feet and it's got enough prominence, I don't care if it's ranked or unranked. But
Yeah. I think it's less important. You think of something like Gemini is well above 13. That's like 13.8 something. And
yeah,
yet,
it's a centennial.
but I don't think it's ranked.
It may not have enough separation from Dyer, or it may not be.
Or Sherman, because I think if it is prominence, then that would kind of make sense because you're kind of ridge walking towards
Yeah.
Gemini and Dyer, right? Like that's not a whole lot of prominence between those three.
Or like North Massive and
Oh yeah,
Mount Massive. North Massive is unranked.
yeah. But there's like 270, 280 feet of prominence, so it just narrowly misses, and it doesn't have a name. It doesn't have a formal name either.
I think that's kind of
That's
where
it.
that's a lot of what I think Middlebrook goes by is whether it's
Yeah,
been named and whether it's been accepted as a peak. And
right,
that's what
exactly.
makes it ranked. But
Yeah.
yeah, so a couple of the peaks that I have hiked went from ranked to unranked. That didn't rankle me, but going from so I look on my glass is half full. I went from having 146 to 147.
Oh gosh. Yeah,
God, that's
I
such a
laughed at that.
dad joke.
I laughed at that way harder than I should have.
That's
Oh my
so crap.
gosh, that was glorious.
Uh, there are times
So,
where I'm like, I'm still young, and then I tell a joke like that, and I'm like, oh, dude.
young at heart.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, so you still gained a net of 113er out of that, right? Is that
yeah.
okay?
That's where I'm at, or at least in my. That's what I'm telling
That's
myself.
how you're perceiving it. Well, and there wasn't because occasionally when LiDAR comes out, there are changes to 14ers as well. Not
Mhm.
elevation necessarily, but whether one is official or not. There's no changes in that,
I
right?
don't think so. I do think they've adjusted the feet on some of them.
Okay.
You can find a summary on. It's in the forum right now, but
Okay.
yeah, I think the feet on some of them got adjusted,
Okay.
but I
I
don't
thought I
think there's any new ones.
I thought I saw a rumor that some folks thought that Huron was going to lose its 14er status when
Oh, because
LiDAR
it's at
came out.
14,003 or
Because it's
something,
like, yeah,
right?
exactly. If He-Man goes to the top and throws a boulder off,
Yeah.
you might lose its status. So
I was kind of hoping that Grizzly would get knocked up because it's
it's like 996 or something, isn't it? Or
990, I think, is what it is. And
something.
I was
Yeah, it's
thinking,
really
I hiked
close.
that this summer. I was like, hope that's on
Yeah.
there,
Well, I
right?
was gonna say when you said grizzly, I thought, is that the real grizzly? Because there's like 5 grizzlies, but
There's
that's the only one that's, really close to being a 14er
yeah, I
even.
should say Grizzly A.
Is that what it is? A.
Yeah, Grizzly A. I almost like Grizzly B. B is in Swatch. C and D are in the San Juans, and there's even an E somewhere. So
Okay.
I have no more hot takes for today, Eric. I'm afraid that mine exhausted me just to think about it. So if anyone wishes to share their hot take with us, how do they get a hold of us, Eric?
We would love to hear your hot takes at greensandbluespodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what grinds your gears. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.